Yeah, thanks, Joachim, for the introduction. Thanks, Lynn, for opening the presentation. Hello, everybody. Yeah, the current situation in Europe. I will present you a bit about the responsibilities and coordination, and also, so first I give you a definition of wildlife, as Joachim also did, then the legal basis, then the implementation, and then it was called neglected species, but I would also say neglected questions we need to have a look on, and then the needs. So how is wildlife monitoring defined? In general, it is monitoring all wildlife, so animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, and habitats. But here we focus mainly on vertebrate species and especially on game species or similar species, so birds and mammals, and also impacting vertebrate species. And I found one comment in our proposal for this subcontract or specific contract in ENETWILD. In Europe, wildlife management is normally undertaken by governmental bodies, so as a diverse range of stakeholders and private organizations. This results in a complex sociological landscape where the process of decision-making requires sound scientific basis, but also considering social and economic factors and their acceptance by society. Now I could stop my talk, but I don't. Monitoring is mainly conducted exclusively for species with an ecological, economic, or sanitary impact, or for species at some risk, endangered or rare species. And in the European Union, same for OIE, wildlife is important for disease, especially for the livestock. And there are two regulations which say more or less wild animals need to be monitored when they are a risk to livestock or human health. For example, African swine fever, rabies, and avian influenza. We have heard about it today. So the other point where there is some legal basis is the Birds Directive, which is quite old in the first version from 1979. And there is a monitoring obligation for a list of species, so all regularly occurring breeding bird species within the annexes 1 and 2, and the key migratory wintering birds have to be monitored. The status report has to be given every 6 years, and the birds derogations have to be reported every year. In the Habitats Directive, some years later, there was also, and still is, also a monitoring obligation for a list of, for all habitats and species of community interest in the annexes 2, 4, 5 for the species, the other species, and for the habitats in Annex 1. Once again, status report has to be given every 6 years, and the other species derogations only every 2 years, not every year. And then there's another regulation for the invasive alien species to be reported every 6 years. The European Union contributes to the costs, via the PAF. So the European Commission enlists the help of the European Environment Agency to do so. How is monitoring done? In case of disease surveillance, some regulations and guidelines are given. For example, in African swine fever, so the EU financially supports a passive surveillance of wild boar, as well as the wild boar management measures in the member states and the neighboring third countries, for example, in the Western Balkans. And the exchange of surveillance data is taking place at regional level. Within the EU, it is coordinated by EFSA, and in the neighboring countries going via the OIE. But for efficiency control of management measures, we also need numbers. So we need a monitoring of the species, not only of the disease. Also in the birds and habitat directives, there are some measures regulated. So the parameters which need to be assessed are the range, the population, and the habitat of the species, as well as future prospects. And there are some definitions for the conservation status in these three categories: secure, not secure, and threatened. However, there are hardly any regulations or guidelines how to monitor the species. What is clear is that the member states are responsible for monitoring. And usually this responsibility is passed through to regional administrations, which very often outsource it to NGOs, agencies, universities, companies, freelancers, stakeholders, and volunteers. This is working quite well in birds. There is traditionally a lot of interest by hobby ornithologists in birds. For example, BirdLife and many other organizations. But it does not work well in mammal species. The EEA sees itself as an agency to support sustainable development, to help achieve significant measurable improvement in Europe's environment by the provision of timely, targeted, relevant, and reliable information to policy-making agents and the public. If you see these words in italics, I would say, what? To be a major information source for those involved in developing, adopting, implementing, and evaluating environmental policy. But how, when all these measures are not really reliable? But there is something quite nice, but I didn't hear before. This is the ETC within the IONET. So there is a network getting the data, but I've not known before. So there is there are some problems within this monitoring. If you look here, 1/3 of the bird data are resulting from a complete survey. Within the other species and the habitats, it's just 1/5 of the data. On the other hand, within those habitats and other species, it is once again 1/5 coming out of expert knowledge or expert opinion, it is called. But in birds, it's a bit better. And there's a strong variability among the countries. For example, in the complete survey, we have countries where there's nearly no complete survey, and others where the data are gathered within the complete survey. In the European Union, about or more than 200,000 people are involved in the monitoring. Sounds quite a big number, but it is just 200,000 people, and 60% of these are volunteers. And you see there's a much higher effort for birds than for other species. So 74% of volunteers in the birds and 44% in the other species. The birds monitoring is quite well organized in the Pan-European Common Bird Monitoring Scheme with the Eurobird portal, which is given by the European Bird Census Council, partnering all the big bird associations and the European Commission. But these are mainly societies and associations for ornithologists, so NGOs. But the good thing on that is that these data these monitorings are based on the Ramsar, AEWA, hope Gitto may say something to that, and the European Union's Birds Directive. So there are some guidelines. Now I come to the neglected species and neglected questions. So within these data given by the EEA, there is a lot of missing data for trends and for the marine environments, and we have a high variability. So there are countries where nearly all data are available, and others have more than 50% missing or unknown data. And once again, the highest proportion is in the non-bird species. Another problem we have to face that is in the non-bird species, we have a high proportion of species with a poor or bad situation. Whilst in bird, it's still a high proportion, but it's much lower. It's just 1/3. Why is it? In the bird species, we look on many of the species. In the other species, we just look for the rare species. So most of them should be in a poor or bad situation. And these rare species are monitored more or less well, but they have seldom an important impact. On the other hand, the common species are seldomly monitored, but have a high impact. One example, meso and large carnivores. They have a low biomass, but a high impact, as they are key species in our ecosystems, as also said before. So they need to be monitored. And it took, for one example, it took more than 50 years in Italy to monitor wolves properly. Fortunately, recently in newly established ranges like wolf and lynx in Germany, the monitoring is going quite well. So let's have a look on the numbers of species. So we have about 900 bird species in Europe, and altogether 150 species, including plants. The EA only names 120,000, so there's a gap, some disequilibrium between these data. And we have additionally invasive species, alone 2,000 alien plant species, and 10% extra mammals in Europe. So these are the species which need to be monitored and which are monitored due to the Habitat and Birds directives. And so one point we can see, birds are monitored quite well. 60% of the species are monitored due to the Birds directive. Within the other species, it's just 2% of all those species. Massimo asked me to show the numbers of the mammals, just in comparison to the birds. I don't know. I could have found out looking to the directives, but I was not able to find any summarizing data on the mammals. And searching for monitoring mammals in Europe, I got bird results. So what's happening with the mammals? There are some other initiatives like LIFE, but these are conservation projects, and it is only conservation only on small scales. This is not systematic monitoring, although there's often a monitoring inside. And we have the IUCN Red List, but this is sampling existing data from volunteers and expert knowledge. This is also no systematic monitoring. But the IUCN Red List lists 25 species as endangered, and they claimed already in 2007 that we need systematic monitoring in Europe. So the rare species belong to nature conservation under this view, and thus belong to the environmental ministries. The common species are of some concern to forestry, agriculture, and/or animal health and human health. that they belong to the Agriculture Ministry and in some cases to Human Health Ministries. And these ministries have different aims, and thus we have different efforts, different funding, and different monitoring methods to within the monitoring. And there's a big need for a coordination of all these different systems. One idea would be one administration underlying this different ministry which is responsible for wildlife monitoring. But it's just one idea, we should discuss it tomorrow. If you don't pay attention to common species, you risk, no wait, you are destroying habitats of seldom species. Common species may additionally play an important role as disease reservoirs, especially in disequilibrium. And common species may decline without recognition if we do not monitor them. Thus, we need a coordination of seldom and common species monitoring. It's absolutely inevitable. For example, one other example in the wolf, we do not only need a monitoring of the wolf, but also the side effects, the behavioral changes of the ungulates, and thus effects on the habitats and many more points. So what do we need in future? I think we need a permanent monitoring, maybe under governmental coordination, which is the obligation. We need funding, especially for the experts, but also for volunteers. We need to be comprehensive and go beyond protective or specific areas, especially in birds. It's very often that they only are monitored in the bird sanctuaries, but not outside. Directly at the border, the counting of geese in Germany stops. And of course, we need to coordinate the monitoring, and we need to monitor many species, not just a few, 2% of the other species. And for that, we need to foster the interest also in more or less unpopular species, for example, the mammal species. And I think all in all, there is a need for a prioritization for linking ENETWILD permanently to the EU. And that's all for this. We should discuss it tomorrow in the workshops.